Today's episode is brought to you by Positively Productive Systems, whose mission is to be the antidote to your stress and to provide compassionate productivity resources and coaching that help you heal and achieve. Be sure to check out both free and paid resources at positivelyproductive.com/resources.
If you Google codependency, you're going to get about 500,000 hits. So I'm going to break it down to how we use this. Codependency is a learned behavior passed down from generation to generation. This is learned. You're not born being codependent in some ways. Naturally occurring relationships that are codependent include an infant and their caregiver. So there's a certain level of codependency because humans are the most complex beings from start to finish. But the idea of growth is to be able to become more interdependent, right? Independent. We don't want to be a codependent where we're relying on someone else for all of our basic needs. So when we're referring to codependency in the helping professions or in the general world, we look at this as an emotional and behavioral condition that affects an individual's ability to have a healthy, mutually satisfying relationship. That's a very fancy way for saying finding balance between giving and taking in relationships. And this can be work, this can be romantic, this can be parent-child, this can be however relationships show up for you.
You're listening to the Positively Living podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Zaratny, founder of Positively Productive Systems and a coach certified in time and stress management, helping clients make space for what matters most in their lives. Join me each episode and we'll talk about decluttering, stress management, habits, personalized productivity, gratitude, and so much more. I understand the overwhelm of life because I'm a wife, mom to kids and cats, and a former caregiver. I'm here to help you choose what's right for you so you can do less, live more, and breathe easier. Sound good? Let's get to it. Are you codependent? Am I? And if so, what does it mean? Is it a bad thing? Oh, so many questions, but thankfully, today's episode has the answers. One of my favorite movies kept popping into my head as I prepared this episode. In The Princess Bride, Inigo Montoya, played brilliantly by Mandy Patinkin, replies to Vizig every time he utters the term inconceivable with, "You keep using this word. I do not think it means what you think it means." And I feel like that's most of our language, but especially the words that are tossed about in the mindset, self-help, coaching part of our world. And it's my goal to clarify these terms, figure out how they apply to us, and use that knowledge to help you live a better life. Today we set the record straight on codependence with an authority on the topic, Mallory Jackson. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, you might recognize the name. Mallory is joining us for the second time. Her first guest appearance was in episode 29 on trauma-informed life. It's the #1 downloaded episode and had so many responses and questions, inspired our conversation today. I highly recommend listening to that episode, not only to connect to its topic, but to find out the strange and fun way that she and I first met. Mallory is an assistant professor of human services and chemical dependency counseling at SUNY Jefferson Community College. She holds master's degrees in public administration and counseling and specializes in trauma-informed care and education within higher education. And along with teaching, she coordinates the Human Service and Chemical Dependency internship program at the college. She's married to her husband, Pete, a New York State conservation officer, and has 2 sons, Logan and Daniel, and a geriatric chocolate lab named Jack. Our extended conversation covers the personal and professional impact of codependency and runs the gamut from defining and detecting codependency in different parts of life to the steps you can take to explore and work through it if you want to change that aspect of your life. You'll find ways to apply this to your relationships at home and in business, and you'll want to listen closely for some powerful descriptions and distinctions about codependency, boundaries, and self-love. Welcome, Mallory Jackson, to the Positively Living podcast, or should I say, welcome back to the podcast. You have the distinct honor of being my first repeat guest. Yeah. Crowd goes wild. Your episode on trauma, #1 downloaded episode since it aired. And I'm so grateful that you shared your wisdom with us and that you have come back to share it again on yet another complex and prevalent topic. I knew you were the person to talk about this, and I'm so grateful you're here.
Thank you so much for having me back. Hello, Lisa's listeners. Thank you so much for the support of the podcast episode. And I think that what is so cool to me are the questions that came out from listeners, right? I mean, the emails, the interactions on Instagram, the what about codependency? We mentioned it in the last episode, but now can we break it down a little more? What an honor. I'm so grateful to be here and always excited to sit and chat with you about these important topics.
So before we get into this particular important topic, the important topic I would love for you to address is a bit about you, what it is that you do, who you are, who you help, really what makes you light up.
Well, for those of you who are listening for the first time, I'm a longtime listener. So I'll recap. Those of you who haven't listened to the trauma episode, my name is Mallory Jackson. I am an assistant professor of human services and chemical dependency counseling at Jefferson Community College in the North Country. I'm a North Country girl, born and raised in the North Country. I have been working in academia for 11 years now. I was a human services professional before that. And, one of my, I think, life calling is connecting people with understanding why they behave the way that they behave, how to better understand their families, better understand what they've gone through in life. And having conversations like this is so wonderful to me because I get to share some of that messaging out with a broader public outside of my classroom space. I just finished class this morning. And so we were actually talking about codependency in class, and it's really interesting to see people understand what has happened to them and be able to label it and validate it and then be able to heal from it. It's so cool. So that's why I'm really here, to be able to share some more of that message with the general public.
Yeah, and I'm so excited to amplify that message because I think it's incredibly important. So that word, codependency, we were talking before, it's like the Inigo Montoya moment. You keep using this word. Let's figure out what it means. And you and I were joking a bit about what could the title of this episode be? Like codependent like me, codependents are us, like what's the deal? And so I think we need to start, as always, with a definition. So help us understand. We use this term, we've heard it, we think we might be it, we might have read about it. What is it?
Well, the nice thing here, just as trauma shows up for people, codependency is a naturally occurring experience in life. Okay. Codependency, by definition, it's a learned behavior. Okay. You're going to see, if you Google codependency, you're going to get about 500,000 hits. So I'm going to break it down to how we use this. Codependency is a learned behavior passed down from generation to generation. This is learned. You're not born being codependent. In some ways, naturally occurring relationships that are codependent include an infant and their caregiver. So there's a certain level of codependency because humans are the most complex beings from start to finish. But the idea of growth is to be able to become more interdependent, right? Independent. We don't want to be a codependent where we're relying on someone else for all of our basic needs. So when we're referring to codependency in the helping professions or in the general world, we look at this as an emotional and behavioral condition that affects an individual's ability to have a healthy, mutually satisfying relationship. That's a very fancy way for saying finding balance between giving and taking in relationships. And this can be work, this can be romantic, this can be parent-child, this can be however relationships show up for you.
There you go. So really, when we're talking about it, it's coming from the point of being the challenge to find the balance. Is that the idea?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And whether or not, some things will come into play, certain things. Codependency as a recognized terminology was founded really in the 1980s, and it was centered around the chemical dependency movement, the addiction movement. It is not a label within the DSM. It's not a full diagnosis. The DSM is our diagnostic manual for addressing mental health disorders, but codependency, it's kind of a widened understanding now moving into this generation where there are complexities with family relationships. And it doesn't have to be based on an alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder, where there tends to be more instances of codependency. We actually recognize that it's based on kind of trauma and what's happened to people and how people choose to parent and how people choose to exist. And codependency is driven by an agreement that I will work harder on your problem and your life than you work on your problem and your life. And it's not love, right? It's control. And that's what we try to reconcile when we're working on codependency issues.
Okay. And the one thing that I was curious about was understanding just a little bit about where it came from. Was this idea of, was this a term that was essentially appropriated, or that more that you discovered really applied beyond the addiction realm, or, you know what I mean?
Yes. And because it kind of came of age in the 80s when people were really trying to decode substance use disorders, I'm not surprised that that's where the word was rooted. Tons of research has been done since then, especially in the family therapy world, recognizing that relationships matter, and codependency can be driven from genetics, culture, right? Family of origin work is huge in codependency work. Family dynamics and how people behave and what you draw as a norm in your family versus what another family thinks about. Trauma experience, girl, we're going to bring up the trauma, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes, codependency is a trauma response. Role models, a lack thereof in life, especially in that early development, can cause codependency issues. Addiction, of course, is on the list, but ultimately the popular buzz phrase is, am I codependent in my romantic relationship? Can I be independent of my partner? And I think that that's where most of the conversations live right now.
Gotcha. Okay. And so that is the perfect segue into who's got it? Who does it affect? Where is it happening? Right?
Everybody's got it. So welcome to the table, friends. We've all got it. And, a lot like trauma, the less you talk about it, the more you have it. So if we just start talking about things, we actually can heal from them and become more aware, right? So codependency is using a relationship in your life, regardless of who it's with or what it's with, to fill a bottomless void because you don't feel loved or you're not having a need met, right? So you're trying to control whatever you can within the situation to get that met. So it's not the need to be loved that's the actual issue. It's the inability to love oneself and recognize value in ourselves. And that's not easy to do. Sometimes, codependency affects spouses, parents, siblings, friends, coworkers. And we're going to talk a little bit about, how that shows up in the workplace, because boy, do we have a lot of codependent leaders. We have a lot of codependent colleagues in our world, and for good reason. Some of it has to exist that way.
Whew, okay. So
that's a lot, Lisa.
Right? Yeah. Excuse me in a moment. So it's all of us. It's all of us, but it's varying degrees and it's showing up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. So for instance, we talk about childhood. Codependent traits serve a purpose in childhood, right? They help us cope with scary, confusing, unpredictable family lives. But then they can cause us a lot of problem in adulthood, right? It gets in the way. Codependency gets in the way of us having happy, healthy family relationships because we're watching and we're retaining and we're learning and practicing some of this dysfunctional behavior that could be deemed as codependent in the name of that just being how it was when we were a kid, right? Or what we watched as normal behavior. And that's a trauma response too.
Like you said, learned behavior. And it's so important. We've talked on the trauma episode, and I've had some incredible episodes on change and fear and talking about emotions in a recent episode on breath work and reducing the stress response. And it's so important to remember that all of these things that we're doing, these maladaptive coping mechanisms, right? Fancy pants here. All of these things that we are doing, they serve a purpose.
We're trying to meet a need. We're trying to cope. We're trying to get something out of a situation or reconcile or understand or connect. And, people ask me all the time, am I codependent? Yes. The short answer is yes. If you're giving more in your relationships than you're getting, you're codependent. If you're a people pleaser, hi, trauma response. Back again, Mallory's here. I'm a people pleaser. I'm a fawner. That's how I'm codependent in my relationships. Needing to be needed. How moms out there, reconciling as your children age, how to go from being that center of the universe to allowing for some independence. Some mothers never learn that lesson and they raise codependent children who become codependent adults. The need to control, and this is my anxiety showing up. I think anxiety shows up in relationships in different ways, codependence being one of them. Conflict avoiders, same thing. If you are avoiding conflict, you may be choosing a codependent response to your relationship.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure that has played a large role in my life. I've always been the peacemaker. And that in and of itself is a beautiful thing.
It is.
But
yes.
Paying attention to the response, and am I, sacrificing myself, my values, is it happening to my detriment that's the question that I ask myself.
Ooh, I think that's such a great opportunity for self-reflection. And one of the ways we heal from codependency, and we talk about this too, is recognizing it, acknowledging that it exists, and watching it show up and actually feeling your feelings. Because what we do is when we're being codependent is that we're numbing. We're trying not to feel something. Okay. So when we look at numbness, we're typically feeling some shame. Maybe we're feeling a little blame associated with the situation. Maybe we're trying to overcompensate for something that we didn't have. We find ways to numb out, and it really doesn't always get tied into a substance. It's often just trying not to feel a feeling.
Right. And so that shame, blame, guilt, whatever it is that we're connecting to. Yeah. And I had a great conversation about the whole like mom guilt realm, right? With Rachel Bailey.
Yeah.
And this idea of you can have guilt, and guilt can be a sign, but it's when it leads to shame, right?
Yeah.
And you go into that realm, that's where I think the real challenge lies. So the shame that you're talking about, here we are, we're trying to cope. There's something that we're not getting, but the real key, and I want to just highlight this again that you brought up, is that there's a distinction here in codependency where we aren't loving ourselves.
Yes, it's boiling down to self-esteem. Codependence numb by obsessing, controlling, and denying. And when you think about when we're in a space where we're obsessing, controlling, or denying aspects of ourselves or our relationships with people, we're actually grieving. We're actually in the first stage of grief, honestly. Like if you think about that, something is making you sad, something is making you upset. We know guilt is a very internal feeling, and then shame is that external perception of the world, right? So you can't have one without the other. They coexist. But if you're codependent, you're going to have a much harder time feeling your way through shame. Okay. And that's when we're working on recovery for codependent behavior, that's stuff we have to practice. We actually have to bring out episodes or experiences in one's life and hash it out and say, okay, when was the last time you felt shame? Why did you feel it? Where did it live in your body? We talk about the somatic or that physical experience. Shame is, for me, it's like in my shoulders, it's my chest. I like, ooh, if I'm feeling shameful about something, I'm really trying to shrink myself down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we have to recognize where that lives and how it can impact our physical health too, because this all lives within our body.
Say it with me, everyone. It's all connected.
You got it.
So that right there, you're touching upon so many different things, and knowing you, I know you have a list. So how codependence shows up, you go ahead and share that list that I know that you have. I guess we'll go for whatever examples that you have so that as we're listening to this, we can start to see ourselves.
Yes. And I would welcome your listeners to remind them to be really kind when you're listening to this list, because you may be hearing things that light up areas of your body where you go, and you start to like hold in a breath. As you're listening to this, please breathe through this, because codependency is very, very fixable. There are so many ways that we can adapt and change our behavior to be who we want to be and be less codependent. So codependents have low self-esteem. They're looking for anything outside of yourself to feel better. So many times that's found as an external: alcohol or drugs or nicotine. Workaholics, hyper-productivity people, they can absolutely use that to help, bolster self-esteem. Gambling, weird friendship behaviors, and that sort of thing. But here's the key. Codependent people have really, really good intentions. And that's what I think is really important to remember. You really want what's best for people in your heart. We see that. It's real. That's not a fake thing. But there are some very clear characteristics of codependent people. So here they go. A tendency to confuse love and pity. You're not there to rescue people. If you're a rescuer and you're listening to this, breathe now. Exhale. A tendency to do more than your share all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A tendency to become hurt when people don't recognize your effort. This lives in friendship, especially adult friendships, just widely in modern day, especially with COVID and everything that's been going on. People are less connected. And a lot of people are feeling this like, well, I make more of an effort than they do. This is a codependent situation, you guys. An unhealthy dependence on relationships. The codependent will do anything to hold on to a relationship in order to avoid feeling abandonment. That's the key here. It's not because the relationship is the most important thing. It's because feeling abandoned is worse. Whew. Extreme need for approval and recognition. Millennials, what's up? What's up, millennials? A sense of guilt when you have to assert yourself. This is a codependent. This is big in the workforce.
Oh man, is this the sorry thing? Because I have been on that forever. I'm like, wait, stop saying sorry. I mean, say sorry if you've done something wrong. But
yeah, not long ago, I was teaching a class of apologizers. This lovely group of students, they're apologists, and I say all the time, stop it. Instead of saying you're sorry, say thank you.
Yes.
Reframe this.
Yes.
This came out. Glennon Doyle talked about this on a podcast somewhere, and it blew up all over the place. And I really enjoy her. I think she's an excellent writer. But reframing is what she's doing here. So instead of saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm late," you say, "Thank you so much for waiting for me."
Yeah,
that's it. Reframe it.
Gratitude, right? Comes back to gratitude all the time.
It does.
It acknowledges that someone did something for you. Perhaps they went out of their way for you. They gave you some grace. They gave, extra patience. Don't we all need that? And that's a beautiful thing. So instead of apologizing that they had to, and you know what that gets into, or at least it makes me think of, is those who have a difficult time receiving help, receiving gifts, right?
Yes, of course. And that's all learned behavior too, because someone along the line told you don't take from people.
Exactly.
I think anyone who's in a helping profession or feels a call to be of service, we're human givers instead of human takers. A lot of people are human takers, really, really good at taking what you're doling out, really happy to receive. When you're a human giver or a caregiver or somebody who is called for a life of service or career of service, we oftentimes become codependent on the area of receiving. It feels strange for us to be accepting of that. That's something that you have to work on. It's a characteristic of a codependent person. A compelling need to control people. This shows up all the time in a variety of relationships. And this can be like little bits and pieces of control where it's like letting your child get themselves dressed in the morning. Those of you who have a child who doesn't understand that polka dots and stripes don't really go great together, but they like it, so they want to wear it. I'm speaking, of course, this is realistic. This is not a figurative example.
I feel like this comes from someplace in reality.
It does. So like recognizing free will and recognizing that you're trying to teach somebody to think for themselves and be independent is a way to practice recovery from codependence. In relationships, this shows up in romantic relationships, especially. This shows up in more insidious ways where you actually view and watch a controlling partner dictate who you spend time with. And, this can borderline on emotional and mental abuse if it's taken to the extreme. When we're looking at codependency as a spectrum, we can have minimal codependency where it just kind of shows up. And then we can have severe codependency, which really brings us into the realm of very maladaptive behaviors.
Understood. Okay. That's a lot of examples. And I think, and I checked off most of them. So if you're,
me too.
So stay with me. So first of all, let's take a moment to breathe, right? Inhale, everyone. And exhale. It's okay.
Yeah, we're codependent and we're all in this together.
Absolutely. So now that we're in it together, let's talk a bit about what we can do. What are we seeing? How can we work with it in different places, in relationships, in, business and the office? And what can we do?
Sure. One of the most effective ways, working as a therapist and as a professor, I always say self-reflection is the first step of anything, right? So asking some questions to help you identify some of your signs and where they live can not only help you better understand it and become aware, but also can help your therapist or your life coach or whoever you're working with help better guide you in a direction that is working for you. So some of the questions that I would use, there's, of course, please understand, I am not your therapist here. A lot of this would be done with a very clear diagnostic questionnaire or at least some guided question points. So Please know this is for entertainment purposes only, right, Lisa? Like no one's going out there.
Exactly. This is pure self-reflection. But what's amazing about this is you don't know what you don't know. So when you start to have the questions and you can start to ask yourself that and then say, oh, I need assistance in asking and answering these. And then you go and you find the support that you need.
I love that. So some of the questions that I would ask to identify signs of codependency. Are you always worried about others' opinions of you? And when I think about that for myself, I go, there are people in my life that absolutely I'm very considerate of the fact that their opinion matters to me.
Absolutely.
Right? That's reasonable. When it gets to the spectrum of I need everyone to like me, I need everyone to think I'm the nicest person in the world, then it becomes maladaptive. We don't like that. Are the opinions of others more important than your own? Ladies, this is that female mental load that we carry all the time. You can stick that right in the back of your head to wake up at 3 a.m. and think about that, because boy, oh boy, do we do that a lot. Are you uncomfortable expressing your true feelings to others? This is part of that numbing piece, right? This is part of that. I don't want to be seen. I don't want that known. Do you feel humiliation when someone you care about makes a mistake? Yikes. Do you have difficulty talking to people in authority, such as a police person, law enforcement officer, or your boss or your supervisor? Do you feel a sense of dread, or do you feel a sense of overwhelm when you are talking to someone who technically has some form of control over you? This is big right now in our society, recognizing the power dynamic and how this shows up for us in lots of different ways. Do you have trouble saying no?
I'm sorry. What was that now?
Did you have loud circus music playing when I started?
La 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 la. I can't hear you. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So on the end of, do you have trouble saying no? Do you also have trouble asking for help? That's a trauma response too, not feeling like people are going to show up for you. So not even bothering to ask the question. That can be a very clear sign of codependency. And so these are just a few of a million questions. And I'll, of course, send, Lisa, all the links, and people can look at this more themselves. But I think that those are some of the initial questions that I like to ask.
Good. Thank you. That's a great starting point, because it helps to have a jumping off point to start asking questions, to start acknowledging it. And perhaps you acknowledge some of these things and you're like, ooh, I do, but I'm working on it. But I don't feel as though it's really getting in the way. I talk about clutter all the time, and I love Peter Walsh's quote. It's not just the stuff on the floor. It's whatever gets in between you. I'm paraphrasing now. Yeah. Whatever gets in between you and the life you want to be living. And that's that same idea of talking about anything such as codependency. Is it getting in the way of the life that you want to be living? We're exploring here. So keep an open mind and have grace with it. I would love for you to share what you told me when we first hopped on the call about your conversation in class. I think that's so important. Yes. I want to make sure that we make space for that, because it is powerful.
I think that, one of the biggest gifts that I think any student who's in higher ed that wants to be in a helping profession can take is a counseling skills class. And so Lisa's referring to a class that I was talking about. And one of the books that I require for the class, because I think it's so powerful, is Melody Beatty's The New Codependency. So all of my students read the book. And we have great book discussions on this. And I can honestly tell you, it's one of the most life-changing books that you will read if you are attaching yourself to anything that we're talking about today. This is a crash course in codependency. It's really well done. But one of the conversation points that came back as a result of our class conversation, and I had to write it down because it was so good, is a few of my students recognized that codependents love others unconditionally, yet they love themselves conditionally. So this is such an important thing to think about, is you actually, as a codependent person, have all of this space. You're holding all of this space for people to show up exactly who they are. And yet you make a choice every day to not extend that same grace to yourself.
Yeah, let's say that again for the people in the back. Okay.
Right. So think about this. Codependents are going to love others unconditionally. There's going to be everything that they can do to live their life, and you're going to show up for them. But you will not give yourself the same grace, because you're telling the world that you actually have conditions for self-love. That's not love, that's control, right? So our job here, when we're trying to heal from codependency, is to do some of that self-awareness, self-esteem building. And that's ultimately what we have to do to recognize that we want to be different. We want to feel better. And you have the capacity for unconditional love because you're showing it to everybody else except yourself. So let's try to do that. Let's try to step out, because what codependency is doing is it's stopping you from fully seeing, hearing, and understanding another person. Okay. Let's extend those opportunities to really dive in and see people for who they are. You're doing it anyways. Maybe put a little bit of that love back on yourself.
Yeah, you can fully see others. It's incredible what will happen when you can fully see yourself. And not just that, but accept yourself.
Yeah. I think when we hold space for people, especially when we're a codependent person, you're either trying to get your needs met in some way, shape, or form, or there's an excessive reliance or dependency on someone else. But there's also this like really oppressive sense of fear of loss. Like you have something at stake if you don't play it perfectly and let people have whatever they want. And what this really represents, Lisa, is just a complete and total lack of boundaries. And, boundaries are the limits of love. That's the rules we set for ourselves. And that's okay, right? Because we have to show up in ways that are not only going to be helpful for the people that we care about, but keep us moving forward. So it doesn't really matter if there's a reliance on a dependency or a substance or, the high of a relationship, the emotional high of a relationship. But one of those first byproducts of codependent behavior is that you're not able to see or hear or understand the person that you're trying to love.
Man, I wrote down boundaries are the limits of love.
They are. Love is an all-encompassing word. About you could replace it with respect, you could replace it with peace, you could replace it with any word you want. But ultimately, I think that when we're discussing relationships and codependency, I think of, here are my rules for loving me. Tell me your rules for loving you.
Yeah.
And that's beautiful. Those are the relationships that I want.
Absolutely. And what I love even more is that this translates more than you may initially think it does into, shall we call it, the more practical and structured side of life. And so that, my friends, is our segue into how this touches upon productivity in the workplace, in our businesses. We talk about boundaries all the time and we think of that as, oh, well, this is what's on my calendar and, or I have a door closed or open. But again, it does all come back to love. It comes back to self-love. Self-worth just keeps coming up for me every time you're describing these things. I'm like, when we feel like we deserve.
Yeah. I think of when I explain this concept of self-worth to my students, I say, you are pre-approved for this life. Just being here, you're pre-approved. So let me decode whether or not you're worthy of being here. You're pre-approved to be on this planet in this space right now with these people, with this connection, with this opportunity. So let's get worthiness right out of the way, because I see you as a completely whole and worthy individual. And that's where we start, and I think with codependency, it impacts all other areas of our life. Like you said, it impacts our career. It impacts the ability to live and breathe and experience relationships in a fulfilling way. And it also impacts our finances and whether we feel like we are worthy of our mental and emotional well-being. Yikes. So codependency impacts a lot of different areas. And when we look at the physical impact of codependency, we can see where it shows up in our body and our brain. Another student said to me that they felt codependency was a relationship addiction. Oh, I love it. So when I think about relationship addiction, that can, of course, span from everything from, romantic to platonic, whatever. But when you look at how people get wrapped up in their identities within a relationship, it's true. So this is compulsive need to really live in the space and the world of a partner for them and not for yourself, which, a little edgy, but okay. I think that we're not respecting our boundaries. We're not looking at how we value areas of our life, and we're truly living for someone else. And that doesn't feel good in the body. We're meant to be social creatures. We've got millions of years of evolution backing us up that there is a certain amount of codependency that we have to have as a society to live. But part of the human experience is supposed to be a healthy sense of self and independence. And if we want to become that self-actualized, that best version of ourselves, we've got to be able to be whole on our own first. So when we're constantly addicted to the relationships that we're in, it is corrosive for self-awareness and love.
Right. It's I might as well stay with him or her
Right.
rather than being alone kind of thing. And to be clear, when we're talking about all of this, we're talking about, how we're social creatures and we want to work as a community. That's incredibly important. There's a distinction here. And again, it's this idea of, do we want to work as a team? Do we acknowledge that collaboration can be really powerful? That's this podcast for me. I love collaboration, but the question then becomes, well, but is that to my detriment?
Right. And what am I replacing? Right. So like you're not replacing, you're actively going into situations saying, I want to connect because I want to have the conversation. We want to learn. We want to share. That's not codependent at all. That's actually very interdependent because you recognize the benefits of collaboration. The codependent side would be Lisa calling up people and saying, I need you to be on here and I need you to do all of these things. And I'm going to control everything that you say and I'm going to control everything that you do because it's a message that I'm trying to get out through someone else. And it's very different energy behind that. And, we see this a lot in the workplace, especially when we have like boss and subordinate relationships. We see this a lot with highly productive people. And I'm very sorry for your listeners who consider themselves to be highly productive people. But I think that the conversation leans into this elusive pursuit of perfection and why we're seeking things out. And I know that you've spoken so beautifully in other podcasts about recognizing the differences between productivity and busy for the sake of being busy. And when you're busy for the sake of being busy, I recognize that as seeking perfection, trying to fill some sort of need, either recognized or unrecognized. But when I'm thinking about codependency in a workplace related to productivity, I look at whether or not an individual knows what's good enough for someone else. Not just good enough for someone else, but also what they're good with too, right? So recognizing that doesn't always look the same. What's good for one might not be good for you. And it's this ongoing self-comparison to some ideal standard that you've created in your brain through your own self-judgment and self-shaming if you don't get it right. So I don't necessarily know how your listeners are going to feel about asking yourself the question, who am I doing this for? Am I doing this to please somebody else? Am I doing this because it's been imposed on me since childhood that my parents told me the house had to be perfect and there could never be a hair out of place and that everything had to be, I have to be busy all the time. One of the things that I recognized for myself in productivity after we spoke last time, Lisa, was, okay, how does this show up for me? And then I looked back at the last few years. I'm like, oh, wow, I don't remember a time where I ever felt comfortable not having something to do. Like I needed a task, very task-oriented person. And I started forcing myself to stop providing myself tasks every day. Like I know I need to do these 5 things. I actually stopped that because it was becoming, what's the word I'm looking for? Disordered almost. Like I was looking at this from a sense of I am not enough unless I do this. And when I started to reframe it based on your suggestions of these are the things I get to do today.
Yeah.
I'm excited about doing these things today. I shouldn't have a sense of dread. That's not productivity. That's busy, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You're thinking in terms of your why, right? And your purpose behind what you're doing. And also too, there's a big distinction between the identification of I'm doing these things and therefore when I do them, I am now worthy. I am now enough versus this is who I am. This is what I love to do. This is how I want to show up. Mom's great example is if this is your value to show up for your children and to be there and to do the things for them and to cut the crusts off the bread or whatever random thing it is that we do as moms, then that's a beautiful thing. If it's, I'm not a good enough mom unless I do these things, now you're putting this caveat. And to me, that's how I feel the distinction is there. But there are things that I do that may be extra effort and may even be busy, but I want to do those things because they connect to me. Now, you're right. We could go deeper and say, where does that value come from? Are you okay with it? It depends. If you're feeling good about life, yeah, sit back, have a beverage, you're good to go.
Yeah, some people do. They're comfortable in codependency. Some people are.
Then, I'm not the one to say what you do next, regardless. And for sure, if you feel good with where you are, I say celebrate that, right?
Yes.
But if something feels off, we want you to have these questions and this perspective. And you're absolutely right about that distinction, though, between being busy and being productive and questioning where it's coming from. And as if your timing could not be better, as usual, I just re-released, if you will, a document that I had written when I first started coaching. It was something that I observed and I didn't quite know what to do with it. It was just one of those things. It was like a download. I pulled it out and I was like, here are the things that I'm seeing. And now you're helping me understand what they are. And the document, which can be found on my homepage and in the free resources library, is called Stop Saying Should.
No shitting on people. Stop shitting everywhere.
Enough with the shoulding. Should.
There's should everywhere.
There is should for miles. Yes, exactly. So it's 7 ways that we sabotage our happiness and our productivity. And spoiler alert, one of them is saying should. And so it's the things that you need to question to say, where is this coming from? Why am I doing it?
Well, I think it's so cool because when we recognize codependency as a learned behavior, this is good because it also means that you can learn other behaviors.
Yes.
How nice for us to be able to take this. There are a few tools that I think can be helpful for your listeners because I know that you all want your strategies and your tools, and I love it. I think it's great. So the first thing I would suggest is communicate how you feel directly to people. This is learning how to use language. Okay, folks, we're going to have to talk using iMessages. When you did this, I felt this. There's your sentence stem. You're welcome. Okay. Ask for what you want. People cannot read your mind. This passive aggressive relationship nonsense that I hear about from people in romantic relationships, nobody's out there reading your mind. You might be with a very perceptive person and you yourself as a codependent individual might be highly attuned to what people are expressing to you. You still have to speak up. Saying no, love it. No is a complete sentence, my friends. Complete. Does not require justification, does not require further explanation. It's nice if you get it, but be mindful that no should be enough. No will be enough. Another tool, the B word, my favorite B word, boundaries.
Oh, that one. Okay.
Yeah. So boundaries are the limits of love. They are the physical and emotional limits we set to protect ourselves. That's it. Okay. Before letting other people know what is okay and what is not okay, we have to define it for yourself. So if you don't understand what your boundaries are, start exploring. That's going to be a tool you have to recognize. Please keep in mind when you set boundaries with other people. Okay. Again, here's some sentence stems for you. Use simple and direct language. You have to explain what the boundary is and what you will do if it will continue to be crossed. Example for you. Please do not yell at me. If you continue to yell, I will leave the room. There you go. Boundary. 2 sentences, easy peasy, 9 words, does not get much easier. When please don't do this or please do this, and there's the consequence at the end, 2 sentences. You can certainly, please, when you're setting a boundary, it's important that you follow through and that you be consistent. Okay. It's very hard to see somebody behave in a new way and it being kind of all over the place. Consistency is key. That's going to be an important part of healing and moving forward with some of your codependent behaviors.
That also helps you from a habit standpoint because you are teaching yourself a new behavior. So some of the things that Mallory's describing here, keep it super simple. That's important for habit development.
Yes. And you can set those internal boundaries with yourself. That's really what I like, that what you're saying right here and how it's all connected.
Exactly. And so when you're setting this up to be in practice, do it in a way that feels doable for you. And that's a habit tip right there. You have to come up with something that's super, super simple where you're like, I could do that. I'll give you an example for Mallory's say no. She's absolutely 100%, maybe 1,000%. I don't know. Statistically, I'm not really a math person, if that's possible, but if it were, you would be correct in that it's a complete sentence. However, if you have been a people pleaser and codependent and has struggled to say no for so long, you may not be able to jump to the no. However, I will give you a tip today, and this will be a practice, that the response that you give, because initially it was always this knee-jerk reaction of sure, yes, absolutely, because you wanted to please. Instead, you take a deep breath and you say, let me get back to you.
Love it.
That's all you do.
Pause.
And you can do that. Yes, it gives you a chance to pause, to breathe, to step away, to think, to not be in someone's face where you have that tension and that energy where you immediately want to go with that gut response. It gives you a chance to step away, and then you can use other interesting techniques. If there's someone who perpetually asks you to do things in a volunteer situation and you always want to say yes and you say, let me get back to you, you can then step back. And again, we don't want to over explain. You don't need to justify, but go with what feels comfortable. Maybe emailing feels more comfortable because it's not like right face to face. You're getting used to creating these boundaries. So you can email and say, thank you so much for thinking of me. You know that I always love to help. I can't do it this time. Think of me again. Or my other favorite part is once you've stepped back, you can also negotiate. You would be amazed how many times someone asks you to do something. And when you come back and say, I can't do that. I'd still love to help. I could do this. How many times they say yes?
Wow, this is so great because I think it leads us to the conversation about making yourself a priority, right? It's not selfish to take care of yourself. I think about the flight attendant, right? Ever ridden on a plane with a flight attendant, explaining the safety precautions to take if the cabin loses air pressure, put your mask on first. A lot of people say, no, I'm going to help the child, but no. This story shows up in all areas of our life. If you do not take care of yourself first, you may not be able to do anything else. The more you care for yourself, the more space you have to give. So if you're naturally a codependent person and you're a giver, the best gift you can give yourself is to just refocus some of that energy back. Okay. And then your boundaries will kind of clear themselves out. It like gets rid of the cobwebs of all of these kind of weird behaviors that you're bringing with you from a lifetime of learning patterns about how to please little girls, women. We have a really hard time with this. And this isn't to discount the men who might have grown up in these scenarios too, but I don't know. I was raised in a situation where it's like children are seen and not heard, like you follow directions, follow the rules. And so how that transposed for me in my life is I got my name written on every chalkboard in the school district because I couldn't keep my yap shut because I needed a place to be able to do my chatties. And these codependent behaviors show up in lots of different ways. So moms and dads, parents, caregivers, please be mindful that your patterns are being watched and they're being spread out through the next generation. So you can heal. Please don't make that your children's responsibility to heal the stuff that you're not brave enough or prepared enough to heal. There are resources out there. There are therapists, there are coaches. There are so many different avenues of support groups. There's codependent support groups out there too that aren't just related to dependencies. And I'm happy to share some resources with Lisa. And I know you'll put that up on the page, but we can talk way more about that. But there are so many options for helping, and it's not as difficult or challenging day to day when you have some tools to use.
Beautiful. And I think that is where we need to wrap up. Oh, there's so much goodness, but we want this to be digestible and doable. So yes, keep this in mind. You're being curious, right?
Yeah, that's all it is ask questions and be a little reflective, right? Just reflect a little bit. See where you sit on that spectrum.
Exactly. And know that you are worthy. That is...
Yep. You're pre-approved, my friends. You're pre-approved.
Love that so much. Okay, let's do the rapidest wrap up that we can, Mallory. So are you with me?
I'm with you.
Fill in that blank for me. The song that always makes me dance is...
It's still Girls Just Want to Have Fun. I cannot deviate from this. That has not changed.
I am
still
totally
excellent.
okay with that. We'll put it on the Spotify playlist, the Positively Living Podcast, Spotify playlist volume 2. So just a little more Cindy, a little more awesome. The quote or mantra I share all the time is...
all is well.
Beautiful. And resource book or app besides Melody Beatty. I'm kidding.
Oh my gosh. Everything by Melody Beatty. All of her stuff is great. Honestly, I think for your listeners right now, I think your safest space instead of reading a book other than Melody Beatty would be to do a little Google, my friends. Do a little Google about, am I codependent? How does codependency show up? If you're not ready to read a book, start to kind of like dip your toe in the water, my friends.
Yeah. Maybe, there's bound to be a quiz out there. There's quizzes for everything,
I'm sure BuzzFeed has created one if they haven't already.
Thank you. If there's a what kind of potato chipper you are, I'm taking that quiz. So you know what I'm saying? Okay. And last but most definitely not least, what or whom are you grateful for today, Mallory?
I am deeply grateful for the fact that I have been vaccinated for the COVID-19 vaccine. I feel very, very lucky, and I need to keep expressing my gratitude for the opportunity to keep my neighbors and my community safe.
That's beautiful. And I am deeply, deeply grateful for you, for our time together, for your wisdom, your generosity, for how you shine your light in this world, and that you share it with us repeatedly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today. Your time is precious and limited, and I'm honored you chose to spend it with me. If you have feedback, questions, or want to schedule a chat, head to positivelyproductive.com/connect. And if you are looking for any of the resources referenced on the podcast, from books to products to training and more, go to positivelyproductive.com/resources.